Steam hung low over the platform, as if the air itself were hesitating, thick with coal smoke, and shouted instructions that overlapped without order. Evacuation notices had been posted only hours earlier, and families pressed toward the carriages with bundles tied in cloth and small cases clutched tight against their ribs. The whistle sounded once, long and warning, and the station master began waving the final boarding list above his head while soldiers guided people toward assigned compartments. She ran along the edge of the platform, breath short, coat unfastened, one hand gripping a folded paper that had been stamped 2 weeks earlier but bore no fresh clearance mark. A clerk blocked her path near the rear carriage and demanded to see her name on the manifest before allowing her near the steps. When he scanned the page and did not find it, he shook his head sharply and pushed her back, saying the evacuation numbers were fixed and that no additions could be made without prior authorization. The second whistle sounded, shorter and urgent, and the train shuddered as the engine began to pull the line forward. She stepped sideways, trying to move past him, but two men already on the step refused to give space, unwilling to risk losing their own assigned places. The wheels turned slowly at first, iron against rail with a grinding reluctance that quickly built into motion. The platform began to slide backward relative to the carriage doors. She kept pace alongside the final car, her boots striking uneven boards as the train gathered speed. A soldier near the middle carriage shouted for civilians to clear the edge, though the clerk folded the manifest as if the matter were settled and turned away. She reached for the railing of the last car but lost grip as the metal jerked forward, and for a fraction of a second it appeared the decision had been made for her by steel and timing. The sergeant had been standing near the baggage wagon reviewing departure lists when he saw the movement at the far end of the platform. Not the run itself, but the refusal of space. He moved before calculating consequence. The train was no longer creeping. It had begun its steady roll. He crossed the platform in long strides and reached the last car just as she stumbled, one foot catching between boards. Without breaking pace, he seized her forearm firmly and stepped onto the moving footboard himself, bracing his weight against the metal rail. The train pulled harder, dragging both of them forward in one unified motion. For a second, their balance hung between momentum and gravity. Then he tightened his grip and lifted, pulling her up onto the narrow platform between cars. The wind from the engine's forward motion caught the edge of her coat as the station receded behind them. Voices on the platform blurred into distance. The clerk shouted something about authorization, but the words dissolved beneath the rhythm of wheels on track. The sergeant steadied her against the carriage wall until her footing aligned with the narrow step. Around them, passengers inside the compartment pressed to windows, faces drawn by the sudden addition at the rear. He did not release her arm until the platform had fully vanished from view and the train had committed to open line beyond the station. The evacuation had begun without her name on the list, yet she stood now on the last car as smoke trailed behind them, and the rails carried them forward whether sanctioned or not. The wind from the forward motion pressed against the narrow footboard as the sergeant guided her fully inside the rear carriage, where the air smelled of damp wool, metal dust, and fear disguised as discipline. Passengers shifted to make space while a junior transport officer pushed through the aisle, having heard the disturbance at the back of the train. He demanded an explanation before even glancing at her face, and the sergeant answered without apology that she had boarded under emergency authority due to manifest irregularity. The officer immediately requested documentation, stating that evacuation quotas were calculated per car and that unregistered additions risked overcrowding and supply miscalculation for the journey ahead. She stood beside the window, steady now, but aware that the protection granted seconds earlier was not the same as acceptance. Her folded paper, creased and faded, lacked the fresh clearance stamp issued that morning at the platform desk. The junior officer reviewed the passenger ledger clipped to his board and confirmed that her name was absent from the authorized list transmitted from municipal registry. He asked how she had reached the station without updated clearance, and she explained quietly that her previous registration had been approved during winter relocation planning, but that when final lists were posted that morning, her name was missing without explanation. The sergeant requested the officer to verify whether the omission corresponded with any late-stage amendments or clerical adjustments, but the officer replied that the updated manifest had arrived sealed from town administration and had not been altered by Transport Command. The carriage rocked as the train gained speed, and several seated civilians glanced between them, understanding that a procedural dispute now traveled with them on the line. The officer pressed further, suggesting that boarding without authorization could lead to removal at the next inspection stop if accountability demanded it, and he questioned whether the sergeant had authority to override documented clearance. The sergeant responded that emergency override was permitted when civilian safety was jeopardized by administrative uncertainty, and that denying boarding during motion would have exposed her to risk at the platform edge. However, he acknowledged that formal justification would be required before the next checkpoint. The officer's expression hardened, not from hostility, but from duty, as supply counts, ration allocations, and border verification all depended on precision. He noted that each unlisted passenger required adjusted food distribution and identity validation at the border station. The conversation did not escalate into argument, yet tension settled like an unspoken weight between regulation and judgment. She remained composed, neither pleading nor protesting, and offered to present herself for review at the next stop if necessary. The officer finally recorded her presence in the margin of the active ledger with a temporary notation labeled "Override, pending confirmation," and informed both of them that at the border inspection point, senior command would determine whether she continued the journey or was redirected. The train's rhythm intensified as fields replaced the station's last rooftops, and the initial urgency of boarding gave way to the slower pressure of documentation and consequence, shifting the crisis from physical momentum to bureaucratic scrutiny as the evacuation carried them farther from the platform and deeper into a question that could no longer be decided by whistles alone. The train had settled into a steady rhythm by the time the junior officer returned with a secondary ledger retrieved from the baggage compartment, and with it came a new layer of complication that shifted the conversation from omission to suspicion. He explained that the municipal registry attached to evacuation lists included coded occupation markers assigned during the final months of occupation, and beside her former address, there appeared a notation indicating employment proximity to the Central Railway Depot. The implication did not need to be spoken loudly for others in the carriage to sense it. Working near a depot during occupation could mean many things. Yet in the weeks following liberation, it often carried automatic doubt. She did not react with indignation. Instead, she confirmed that she had been assigned to freight documentation duties during the winter ration period, when civilian labor was requisitioned under threat of penalty. The officer asked whether her tasks had involved direct coordination with transport officials from the occupying authority, and she clarified that her role was limited to copying supply codes and logging freight wagon numbers without access to passenger records. The sergeant listened closely, aware that the difference between freight logs and deportation manifests could alter the entire reading of her past. The officer flipped through supplementary pages and noted that several names marked for evacuation had been flagged earlier in the year due to alleged cooperation with rail supervision staff. Though her name lacked a direct accusation, the proximity marker was enough to trigger exclusion from the initial evacuation list pending review. The carriage felt narrower as nearby passengers absorbed the exchange. A mother pulled her child closer, not in accusation, but in reflexive caution, shaped by months of rumor and retaliation. She spoke again, explaining that during the harshest winter weeks, the depot had become the only heated structure accessible to conscripted civilians, and that refusing assignment would have meant immediate detention. Her statement carried no attempt at sympathy, only context. The sergeant asked the officer whether any cross-reference existed, linking her to passenger deportation schedules, and the officer admitted that none appeared in the summary sheets, only the employment proximity note entered by municipal clerks during transitional administration. The absence of formal charge did not erase doubt. It simply left it suspended. Outside the window, fields blurred into early dusk, and the movement of the train underscored how far the decision at the platform had already traveled beyond its original moment. The officer concluded that the notation alone could explain why her name had been withheld from evacuation clearance until further verification, but he acknowledged that no documented misconduct accompanied it. The problem therefore lay not in proven wrongdoing, but in administrative caution shaped by public sentiment. The sergeant recognized the precarious balance. If she were removed at the next checkpoint without review, suspicion would harden into narrative. If she were cleared prematurely without examination, procedural integrity could be questioned. She remained silent after her explanation, allowing the weight of recorded detail to settle without embellishment. The train pressed forward through dimming countryside as the conversation shifted from immediate boarding controversy to a broader reckoning with how proximity to power during occupation could shadow survival choices long after control had changed hands. The discussion inside the carriage might have settled into silent suspicion had the sergeant not requested access to the freight copy sheets stored in the baggage trunk. And when the junior officer reluctantly produced them, the faded carbon pages revealed a detail that altered the direction of inquiry. Alongside wagon numbers and supply codes were subtle timing annotations written in the margins during winter departures, small shifts in departure minute markings that at first appeared like clerical habit, but on closer inspection aligned with known instances when civilian families had avoided deportation transports by arriving after scheduled closure. The officer compared dates from the freight log to archived deportation times noted in the Provisional Occupation Review file, and the overlap was too consistent to ignore. She explained that she had been ordered to transcribe freight schedules each morning, and that passenger train times were posted on the adjacent board. When she noticed discrepancies between announced and actual departures, she had adjusted freight copy times forward or backward by minutes that caused posted public departure sheets to lag behind real movement. The alteration did not stop trains, but it created confusion long enough for some families to miss loading calls and remain unaccounted for when convoys closed. She had not announced this action publicly, because speaking of it during occupation would have meant arrest not only for her, but for anyone warned. The junior officer examined the carbon layers more carefully and observed repeated instances where freight notations diverged subtly from official dispatch bulletins. The divergences that had once seemed insignificant, but now suggested pattern rather than accident. The sergeant asked whether municipal clerks reviewing occupation files would have interpreted such proximity to scheduling as collaboration rather than interference, and the officer admitted that without cross-reference, the distinction would blur. Her employment marker near the depot, combined with routine access to timing boards, likely triggered automatic caution when evacuation lists were assembled after liberation. The carriage grew quieter as passengers leaned into the unfolding clarity. Suspicion began to shift from presumed complicity to concealed resistance. She did not present her actions as heroic. She described them as necessary adjustments made while pretending obedience. Young, aware that too bold a change would draw attention, and too small a change would accomplish nothing. The officer closed the freight folder and acknowledged that while formal confirmation from archived transport authorities would be required, the pattern of timing anomalies corresponded with recorded irregularities that had frustrated occupation enforcement units during winter deportation cycles. The sergeant recognized that the omission from the evacuation manifest may not have been random clerical caution, but possibly influenced by a local clerk who had remained loyal to prior administration and who might have interpreted her depot assignment without investigating nuance. The train's wheels hammered across a bridge as twilight deepened, and what had begun as bureaucratic uncertainty transformed into emerging evidence of quiet interference carried out under threat. Though no official clearance had yet been issued, the narrative within the carriage shifted from doubt to guarded respect, and the officer noted in his margin ledger that supplementary review at the border station should include cross-examination of freight carbon discrepancies, rather than relying solely on proximity codes assigned during transitional registry compilation. The train had traveled another hour when the forward carriage signaled an unexpected reduction in speed, the steady rhythm of wheels breaking into uneven jolts as the engineer applied gradual braking before a bend known for damaged rail segments. Word passed down the aisle that a section of track ahead had been compromised during retreating sabotage weeks earlier and repaired only partially for light freight use, not full evacuation weight. The junior officer returned from the front car with tightened expression and reported that engineers had received conflicting maps regarding which siding remained safe for temporary rerouting. The official evacuation route required crossing the weakened segment before nightfall, yet stopping entirely would leave the train exposed on open line without guaranteed security patrol. None the sergeant assessed the situation quickly. Either proceed slowly over questionable track and risk derailment under heavy civilian load, or divert onto an abandoned freight siding whose condition was uncertain and poorly documented. The engineer requested any local knowledge that might clarify the safest passage. She stepped forward before hesitation could reclaim her, explaining that during winter freight assignments she had copied siding numbers and that one disused grain spur 2 kilometers east had remained structurally stable because it serviced agricultural storage rather than military transport. The engineer asked how recently she had seen it operational, and she replied that though not used in months, its base rails were reinforced and less likely to have been targeted for demolition. The junior officer hesitated, aware that diverting an evacuation train based on civilian recollection required trust not yet formally granted. Yet delay carried its own danger, as light faded and patrol windows narrowed. The sergeant requested permission to inspect the upcoming junction personally, and, with approval, moved toward the front platform while she accompanied him to identify the correct switch marker once visible. Passengers sensed the change in tone as the carriage slowed further, anxiety rising, not from rumor, but from mechanical uncertainty. Mothers tightened scarves around children while older men pressed palms against seats, as if stabilizing the carriage through will alone. When the junction approached, she pointed to a faded post partially obscured by brush that marked the grain spur turnout, and the engineer engaged the manual lever with careful pressure, shifting the train onto the secondary track. The transition produced a heavy metallic groan that echoed along the cars, and for several seconds every passenger held breath as the wheels adjusted alignment. The siding curved through darker terrain bordered by storage sheds left intact because they had not served occupation logistics. The train moved cautiously along the spur, testing stability before gradually increasing speed once no structural compromise revealed itself. The crisis did not explode into catastrophe. It resolved through measured risk shaped by memory and observation. The sergeant acknowledged that without her recall of depot siding layouts, the decision might have defaulted to uncertain mainline crossing. And the junior officer recorded the reroute in his ledger as civilian-guided diversion, verified safe. The carriage tension eased as open countryside resumed beyond the storage sheds, and passengers returned to quieter breathing, aware that the evacuation now depended not only on engine power, but on knowledge carried silently from a winter spent transcribing freight lines under watchful eyes. The siding curved back toward the main line just before full darkness settled, and though the immediate threat of damaged rail had passed, the diversion left the train slightly behind its projected schedule, which meant the next inspection checkpoint would close sooner relative to their arrival. The junior officer moved quickly between compartments, recalculating passenger distribution in case further adjustment became necessary, and the sergeant remained near the rear car coordinating stability checks while the engineer confirmed alignment integrity after the manual switch. The reroute had prevented mechanical danger, yet uncertainty had not vanished. The grain spur ran adjacent to several abandoned warehouses where occupation forces once stored confiscated goods, and though officially cleared, the patrol logs indicated sporadic looting attempts during transitional weeks. As the train reduced speed again near a signal post, concern spread through the carriages that an unscheduled stop might expose them to risk. The engineer announced that he needed to verify track continuity before rejoining the primary line, and that a brief halt would be required. Passengers shifted uneasily as the carriage settled into stillness, surrounded by dim industrial shadows. The sergeant stepped down first, scanning perimeter structures for movement, and she followed at measured distance, recognizing warehouse outlines from earlier months, when freight logs had required inspection stamps from that very spur. The junior officer cautioned that civilians should remain aboard, but the sergeant indicated that limited assistance could expedite reconnection to the main track before night deepened fully. She identified a storage shed that once housed spare rail fasteners and indicated that manual inspection of the junction bolts would reduce derailment risk during reintegration. While the engineer and a small detail inspected the turnout, a group of displaced passengers at the rear began to panic at the sight of industrial shadows and faint echoes from loose metal sheets striking in the wind. She returned quickly to the carriage and organized them into calmer posture, directing mothers to sit toward the center benches and older passengers to remain near the aisle where air felt less confined. Her tone remained steady, neither minimizing the situation nor amplifying it, and the visible composure had measurable effect on those closest to her. Outside, the sergeant confirmed that the turnout bolts remained intact and that the siding rails showed no tampering beyond superficial rust. Within minutes, the manual lever was reset, and the locomotive prepared to merge back onto the primary line. Before reboarding, the sergeant paused beside her and acknowledged that the diversion had required both memory and nerve, and that managing the interior calm during the halt had prevented unnecessary disorder. The statement carried no sentimentality, only recognition of shared responsibility under uncertain conditions. As the train eased forward again and reconnected with the main route, interior lights flickered back to steady brightness, and tension thinned into cautious relief. The crisis had not been dramatic in spectacle, yet it demanded synchronized action, mechanical precision outside, and emotional steadiness within. When the train resumed stable pace toward the border station, the junior officer updated the ledger to reflect not only the route change, but also civilian passenger coordination during halt, formalizing her role beyond accidental boarding. The journey continued into night not as isolated intervention, but as cooperative navigation shaped by risk acknowledged and managed together. The border station emerged from darkness as a line of fixed lamps cutting through the night, their light steady and procedural rather than welcoming, and the train slowed under controlled braking while uniformed inspection officers waited beside a narrow platform bordered by stacked crates and portable desks. Passengers straightened clothing and gathered documents as the junior transport officer stepped down first to brief the senior Allied commander responsible for clearance review. The sergeant followed, presenting the ledger containing the override notation, freight carbon discrepancies, and diversion record that documented the siding reroute. She remained just inside the carriage doorway, visible but not advancing, aware that final determination now rested beyond immediate intervention. The senior commander examined the ledger carefully under lamplight and asked whether the override boarding had been executed under emergency authority or discretionary preference. The sergeant responded that denial at departure would have placed her in immediate risk, and that subsequent freight log analysis suggested omission from the manifest warranted reassessment rather than expulsion. The junior officer confirmed the margin entry marked override, pending confirmation, and added that during track diversion, she had identified the stable grain spur and assisted in passenger coordination during the unscheduled halt. The commander requested cross-verification with provisional occupation files stored at the border office. And within minutes, an adjutant returned carrying summary sheets listing depot proximity codes assigned during registry compilation. The commander compared the code next to her former address with the freight carbon anomalies noted in the ledger and questioned whether municipal clerks had differentiated between freight transcription duty and passenger deportation scheduling. The junior officer stated that no documented link connected her to deportation lists and that freight timing adjustments aligned with recorded instances of missed deportation departures earlier that winter. The station remained quiet except for distant steam release from the locomotive and the soft shuffle of boots on gravel. After reviewing both records, the commander concluded that omission from evacuation clearance appeared to result from automated caution rather than substantiated misconduct, and that her documented assistance during transit provided sufficient basis for temporary protective designation until full administrative review could be completed. He signed the ledger beneath the override notation and stamped the margin with a provisional authorization seal, allowing continued travel and civilian coordination assignment at the receiving rail camp. The sound of the stamp pressing ink into paper carried more finality than any earlier whistle. The sergeant acknowledged the authorization with a brief nod, and the junior officer updated the passenger roster to include her name formally rather than as a marginal annotation. But passengers inside the carriage sensed resolution not through announcement, but through the steady reopening of compartment doors and the signal from the engineer to prepare for departure. She stepped down only long enough to receive the stamped copy from the adjutant, holding it without display, before returning to the carriage platform. When the train resumed motion past the border lamps, the uncertainty that had shadowed her boarding transformed into structured legitimacy, and the transition from suspicion to documented protection occurred not through public declaration, but through measured review beneath institutional light. The receiving rail camp lay beyond the border hills, where temporary barracks had been arranged along parallel tracks, each marked with chalk numbers and guarded by lanterns that burned through the remaining night hours. When the train eased into its assigned line, passengers disembarked in controlled sequence, while clerks collected stamped authorizations and directed families toward registration tents. She stepped down with the same composure she had carried since the platform incident, presenting her provisional authorization without emphasis, and the clerk marked her name into the coordination ledger rather than the relocation list. The designation shifted her role from evacuee to assistant within the transit structure, and a rail supervisor briefed her on tasks requiring immediate attention: tracking passenger distribution, confirming food allotments, and verifying departure sequencing for onward convoys scheduled at dawn. The sergeant remained on the platform, overseeing transfer procedures. His assignment extended to stabilize rail operations in the region following recent sabotage repairs. Their interaction contained no ceremony. He indicated the storage office where a supply manifest would be kept and reminded her that all coordination entries must align with border-stamped documentation to prevent renewed administrative conflict. She nodded, understanding that continuity now depended on precision rather than intervention. Inside the registration tent, displaced families queued quietly, while clerks recorded names under dim electric bulbs powered by a portable generator. She moved between tables, ensuring that elderly passengers were directed toward seating before processing, and that children remained grouped with assigned guardians, her actions blending into the routine rhythm of relief administration. The night that had begun with motion and uncertainty settled into structured labor, defined by lists and schedules. Outside, freight wagons were decoupled and repositioned for supply unloading, and the sergeant completed perimeter review before submitting transit reports to the camp commandant. The earlier confrontation at the departure station no longer defined her presence. Instead, the ledger entry bearing the commander's stamp anchored her within a framework of responsibility. As dawn approached, pale light revealed the scale of the temporary camp stretching across the valley, and additional trains were signaled from distant lines preparing to arrive. She updated the coordination board with revised departure times for the next convoy, ensuring that no discrepancy mirrored the omissions that had once endangered her boarding. The sergeant passed the board briefly and confirmed alignment with transport orders before continuing toward the engine yard. Neither spoke of the moment when the train had begun to move, nor of the grip that had secured her place upon it. The shared understanding required no repetition. By morning, the camp functioned with measured efficiency, and the evacuation that might have excluded her instead incorporated her skill into its continuation. The war persisted beyond the hills, and future assignments would redirect both of them along separate tracks as operations shifted regionally. Yet within the ordered movement of that rail camp lay a quiet assurance that documentation had replaced doubt, and that survival, shaped by hidden action, had found structured recognition without spectacle or declaration.